Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Night with the Experts. This is our monthly NEIS program taking place on the last Thursday of each month. And we're very, very pleased to have a special guest with us tonight, MV Ramana, who is a professor and author who specializes, whether he likes it or not at this point, on small modular nuclear reactors, which is a very hot topic, not just in Illinois here, but around the country and actually internationally. I'll start out with a little prefacing remarks that today in Illinois, the state Senate voted 39-13 to remove our nuclear construction moratorium, but actually almost the entire debate devolved into what I call a trade show for the small modular nuclear industry folks. They spoke mostly about the benefits that small modulars would bring, and they had no one, of course, available there to discuss some of the downsides. So it's even more important that you hear from the speaker here tonight. For those of you who are new to the program, the way we operate is very simple. We will allow our speaker about 20 to 30 minutes to present information and background on the topic. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jan Budart, who is a NEIS board member, who's going to moderate the second part of our evening, which will be a question and answer and discussion period where you will have the opportunity to speak directly to our guest. And Jan will give instructions on how to do that later on. I'd also mention that tonight's event will be recorded, and we always save the chat because sometimes there are useful links and information put in the chat. Those are available if you send us an email or put your email in the chat box, and we'll make sure you get that information. It's also customary for us to introduce our board members and give them a chance to say hello. So I'll turn it over first of all to Jan Budart. Jan, say hello.
Hi, I'm Jan Budart, and I will be handling the Q&A tonight. Oh, Linda has come. That's
Hi.
great. Hi.
Another one of our board members, Linda Lewison.
Hi, I'm Linda Lewison, and I'm very glad to be here and listen tonight. It's a really important subject to learn about. Thank you.
Are you
Thanks,
on the
Linda.
train, Linda?
No, I'm walking toward my car to
Oh,
listen.
We have one other board member I'd like to introduce. That's Stephanie Blanco.
Hello, I'm glad you all are here to listen to this very important topic. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Stephanie. All right. Let's not waste any more time. Let's get to the meat of the matter. I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, MV Ramana. So take it away. It's your show tonight.
you're on mute, Ramana.
1 second. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. The unmute button moved away from my screen to another part. So anyway, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be speaking for the Nuclear Energy Information Service. I bring you greetings from Vancouver in Canada, where I'm speaking from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. I would like to start by mentioning that I changed the title of my talk. When I sent the abstract, I thought of something really klutzy. And then as I was writing, I said, maybe I should be more direct and explain what I'm going to say. There's no secret here. What I'm going to argue is that small modular nuclear reactors won't solve the problems confronting nuclear power or help with mitigating climate change. So, okay, let's see. Yeah. Dave mentioned that today's debate in Illinois featured small modular nuclear reactors, and that's hardly surprising because the media all over the world is sort of, or at least those countries which are interested in nuclear power are all talking about small modular reactors. And they're often talking about it in the present tense as though they actually exist, and they make various assertions about it. But as I'm going to explain to you, most of it doesn't really hold. So the outline, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what are small modular nuclear reactors and try to explain why there is this talk about small modular reactors by contextualizing where we are with nuclear energy in general, what are the kind of claims that are being made of these reactors, and then offer a kind of reality check. And if I have time, I'll sort of go into why these claims are being made, but maybe not. Okay, so small modular nuclear reactors are at this point mostly theoretical reactors. There are a couple of them operating one in China and one in Russia, but for the most part, they are theoretical constructions. There are sort of two parts to the term small modular reactors, the small and the modular part. Small just means that the design power output capacity is under 300 megawatts. And about 300 and up to 700 megawatts is often called medium. The term small should not be confused with any sense of how big they are physically. Some small modular nuclear reactor designs are pretty small in terms of, I'm here, I have a picture here in the below the little table, which shows how much different designs, the sizes of one of the important components of a reactor. And you can see that they vary by quite a lot. And so it depends very much on the specifics of the design. Some of them are physically small, some of them are physically large. So that's something to remember. The other term, modular, basically means that the reactors are meant to be constructed from modules that are made in factories. Now, this might seem kind of unusual, but if you think about it, this is how we do most of our manufacturing. If you were to look at a house being built today, very few people are going to be bringing wood to the site and bringing carpenters there and then trying to make them assemble doors and windows and wall paintings and so on and so forth. Everything gets manufactured in factories, and they're sort of moved to the site and basically stuck together or stapled up or something of that sort. And that's the same manufacturing practice that the small modular reactor vendors want to use. And it's also something which large reactor vendors are using these days. So that's the most important meaning of the word modular. And I'll sort of get into the implications of that later. Before going into the virtues and the vices of small modular reactors, let me explain why people are talking about small modular reactors. And the simple answer is that the nuclear construction, reactor construction, has not been in good health for a long time. For those industries which want to build nuclear reactors, their best days are decades ago. Most of the world's reactors were built in two big waves, one in the 1970s, mostly in the United States, and one in the 1980s, mostly in Western Europe and many other parts of the world. And since roughly the mid-1980s, you can kind of date it to the 1986 Chernobyl accident. After that, the rate of construction or reactors being added to the grid has declined dramatically. And there are even some years when more reactors have been shut down than added. And the net result has been that the capacity of power production from nuclear reactors has more or less stayed constant for the last 3 odd decades. But at the same time, the grid has been growing. A lot of other sources are being added to the grid. And as a result, the share of global electricity generated by nuclear power plants has been declining continuously since the mid-1990s. It was about 17.5% in 1996, and it has declined to under 10%. It's 9.8% in 2021, the last year for which we have figures. And so the graph on the top side sort of shows how the share has been declining. And it also shows how the share of renewable electricity has been increasing around the world. And so it's not that people are not trying to move away from fossil fuels, but they're just not moving to nuclear power, they're moving to renewables. And this is the essential conundrum which sort of has been dealing, that the nuclear industry has been dealing with. And the main reason why nuclear reactors are not being constructed is because nuclear power is not economically competitive. Reactors cost too much to build, and so utilities simply decide that it is not worth for them to build reactors except under very special circumstances, and I can go into that during the Q&A. But in parallel, other sources of electricity are cheaper and becoming cheaper. This picture here shows the cost of generating electricity at a variety of technologies from a bunch of projects in the United States. This is produced by a company in Wall Street called Lazard. And Lazard has been doing this for many years. And the plot here shows how the costs of different technologies have been varying over the years. And what you see is that while wind and solar have been declining dramatically, wind by about 70% and solar by about 90% over the last roughly decade or so, nuclear is actually becoming more expensive. And so to the right now, the average expectation for a new nuclear reactor plant that would be constructed in the United States is that it'll cost roughly around $160 to $170 per megawatt hour for electricity from that. In comparison, wind and solar are running in the $30 to $40 per megawatt hour range. So nuclear is about 4 to 5 times as expensive. And other sources of power are also cheaper. And so obviously, utilities don't want to build reactors. For a long time, the nuclear industry had an answer, or at least a narrative, to talk about these costs of building reactors. And that was to say that we know reactors are expensive to build, but once you build them, they can be operated pretty cheap because the cost of the uranium that is used to fuel them is quite low. But that story became unstuck maybe in the last decade or so. And what we saw was a number of old reactors which had licenses to operate provided by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission for many more decades. But utility owners deciding that the cost of operating these reactors was too high, and so they would prefer to shut them down. So a recent example was in Iowa when the Duane Arnold plant, the utility decided to shut it down because the utility calculated that they would save about $300 million over the next decade or so, as long as the plant was licensed to be operating, by just replacing energy from the nuclear plant with wind energy. And that's kind of an example of how this is happening. To the extent that reactors have not been shut down, it is because states have been subsidizing them. You are all familiar with that in Illinois. Other states which have done the same thing are New York and Connecticut, and so on and so forth. More recently, there have been attempts in California to keep the Diablo Canyon plant alive, even though PG&E had a plan to shut it down in a very negotiated and phased manner. So the fact that we have even as much nuclear power as we have today is because of these state subsidies. And so clearly, in this kind of a climate, the likelihood of utilities building new nuclear plants is pretty low. And the only nuclear plant that is being constructed in Georgia, the Vogtle plant, has gone from $14 billion when construction started to about $35 billion today. Nearly $35 billion. And it's also much more delayed than it was expected. But this is very much par for the course, except that the numbers have become much higher in recent years. So in the past, there was one study carried out that looked at around 180 nuclear projects and found that 97% of them exceeded their budget, on average about $1.3 billion more than expected. And all of them took the majority of them took longer than projected. So Vogtle is just an extreme case of a historical trend. It's not by any means exceptional. So this is the situation in which the nuclear industry started saying, oh, that's all these old nuclear plants. Don't worry, we have a solution. We have these so-called small modular reactors. And these small modular reactors, at least on paper or on PowerPoint, they look much greater, according to them. And so many of these companies which were trying to develop small modular reactors made claims about why they were very good. And I learned this term happy talk from somebody who used to consult for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And NRC basically said, we don't really believe this happy talk. I mean, this is what you expect these vendors to be saying. But nevertheless, it's something which you see all the time in the media. So I thought I'd just very briefly mention some of the kind of claims which are being made. So they would say, these large reactors, they are very complex, but our small reactors are simple. They reduce the complexity. They would say that they are safe, that something like what happened in Fukushima cannot happen at our reactors. They would say that there is no risk of proliferation or the risk that materials from this could be used to make nuclear weapons. They would say, well, traditionally nuclear plants have been built only in countries with large grids and typically near cities, but our designs are so versatile that you could do it in remote areas. We could use it for mines and powering oil and gas production, et cetera, et cetera. In principle, they'll say, oh, you can even put it on a ship or in a submarine, take it to some faraway location and use it to power some city or town that's on land. And most important, they claim that it is going to be cheap. So these are the kinds of claims that you hear from vendors. And of course, one more thing they would often talk about is the fact that they will somehow magically deal with the problem of radioactive waste. Now, I'm not going to go into explaining why they're making these claims. There's plenty of stuff out there on that. But what I'm going to talk very briefly about is whether these claims will actually be realized. And to understand that, you should remember there are sort of, broadly speaking, 4 main problems. One is the one of cost that I talked about. But the others are the fact that reactors can have severe accidents, such as what happened in Chernobyl and Fukushima. The third is that they produce radioactive waste that is hazardous for hundreds of thousands of years. We still don't have a demonstrated way of dealing with that. And lastly, the linkage with nuclear weapons, which is the way that the world first learned about nuclear power. Now, my former colleague Zia Mian at Princeton University and I, when I was there, we looked at a range of designs and what they were trying to do in order to address these problems. And what we found was that essentially the designs, when they try to deal with one of the problems, they will change the design in some fashion, but that change would negatively affect one of the other priorities. So you cannot make a reactor safer and cheaper at the same time. You cannot make a reactor produce less waste and be less proliferation impactful at the same time. So what we found was that most of the time, none of them are going to be met, but some of the time, one of those priorities, let's say safety or waste reduction, will happen, but it will be at the cost of something else. In particular, for small modular reactors, the fact that they are small means that they are going to be more expensive on a per unit capacity. The traditional rule of thumb in general in all industries is that when you make a unit of industrial unit larger, so for example, if you have a nuclear reactor that is producing 5 times as much power, then it is unlikely, it will not use 5 times as much concrete or 5 times as many welds, or will not require 5 times as many workers. And therefore, a larger reactor on a per unit capacity of power production will become cheaper. This is the reason why reactors in the United States and in other parts of the world, when they first started, they used to be much smaller, but over a period of between the 1960s and the 1980s, they became larger and larger because the industry found the only way they could try to control costs was to take advantage of what are called economies of scale. But when you go back to small reactors, you lose out on those economies of scale, which means that the per unit cost for each of these reactors is going to be much higher. And we are seeing examples of that before our eyes in the case of the NuScale project that's being proposed to be built in Idaho. for the Utah Association of Municipal Power Suppliers. The other thing when you have a smaller reactor is that typically it will produce more waste and produce more plutonium or require more enriched uranium per unit of electricity produced. And so if you're going to be generating the same amount of power, then the overall impact from small modular reactors is going to be higher. The industry's answer to this usually is to say, no, we know all that, but we are going to compensate for these diseconomies of scale by being able to manufacture them in the factories. This is where the modular part is supposed to help them. And so they say, well, maybe the first few are going to be expensive, but once you get the factory going, you'll be churning these out like you're going to build tables or iPhones, and they'll become cheaper and cheaper over time. Now, there are sort of two problems with that. First is historically, nuclear plants have become more expensive with time, not cheaper. So the graph on the top right shows the costs of building nuclear reactors in the United States and in France, the two countries with the most nuclear power capacity in the world. And in both countries, costs have actually gone up at a fleet-wide level with time, not gone down. So there's no historical reason to think that in the case of small modular reactors, suddenly they're going to become cheaper. The second is that even if there's going to be some kind of learning, you assume optimistically there's going to be something, the number of reactors that would have to be built up ahead in order to even break even with large reactors runs from maybe an order of about 100 to the order of tens of thousands. It depends on what actually the kind of scaling laws are, and we really don't know what that is. There's no way to theoretically predict it. You'll have to actually build these reactors to see how they're going to scale. But even theoretically speaking, you know that you have to build a large number of them, and all of this is for the small modular reactors to become economically competitive with large reactors. And I already told you that large reactors generate power today at a cost is about 4 or 5 times that of solar or wind. So for small modular reactors to be able to compete with renewables, you will have to, it's never going to happen, essentially. The second thing is that, in terms of some of the bad qualities of nuclear plants, even a small reactor can make a big contribution to proliferation, because even a small reactor requires enough enrichment capacity to build a number of Hiroshima-style weapons and produce enough plutonium to build a number of Nagasaki-style weapons every year. So even saying you have a small one in a country means that that country will have significant capacity to produce nuclear weapons. And the thing to remember is that climate change is only one of the multiple cascading and intertwined global crisis. Nuclear energy is also imbricated in proliferation and nuclear annihilation. Expanding nuclear power and small modular reactors could leave us in the worst of both worlds, that you're going to make the proliferation problem worse without necessarily addressing the climate problem, and explain why the climate problem is not going to be addressed by small modular reactors later on. I'll just say very briefly, just to say, one of the arguments which we hear all the time is that small modular reactors are safe. Is that the case? And the answer is, all nuclear reactors have lots of things that can go wrong. The very structure of this device, which is, ultimately a nuclear reactor is just a very complicated way to boil water. And you're using a very hazardous process to produce the heat that is used to boil the water. So all reactors are capable of accidents where the radioactive material can escape from the reactor and spread out into the environment. And, there's been a lot of theoretical work explaining why that's happening. I'm not going to go into all of the details, but just to say that many of the claims which are being made are really not justifiable. There are sort of judgment calls which are not necessarily reliable. There are organizational conflicts, and all the when nuclear reactor vendors make claims about how safe their reactors is, they use something called probabilistic risk assessment, and they come up with numbers which says, the chance of an accident is 1 in 100 million years, 10 billion years, whatever. Those absurd numbers have no meaning whatsoever because there is no way you can actually prove those things. And so the bottom line is that the probability of an accident at a nuclear power plant you can never calculate it really because you don't know what all can happen, but it's certainly greater than 0. There's no such thing as safe nuclear power, if by safe you mean that it cannot have an accident which releases radioactivity. What do we know about small modular reactors? We've built a lot of small reactors in the past. The United States started its nuclear program with all of these reactors, which I've sort of listed. These all, technically speaking, are all small because they all produce less than 300 megawatts of power. And almost all of them, you will see, they started in the 1960s or in the late 1950s, and they all shut down by the 1970s. So the one that's sort of closest to you was in Elk River, and it operated between 1964 and 1968. The construction cost was over 250% of the initial estimate. And when the reactor was shut down, basically the utility said, we just realized that this was too small and was just not economically making any sense. So they decided to shut it down the first time they had to do a major equipment replacement. Likewise, in Colorado at Fort St. Vrain, they built this high temperature gas cooled reactor, which was supposedly very, very safe. But the reactor kept getting shut down. It operated for only about 14 or 15% of the time it was supposed to. And the New York Times carried a cheeky headline saying the safest reactor is closing because it rarely runs. So that's, I think, what looks great on paper might not actually work in practice. Okay, so I'll sort of try to wrap up by asking the central question, should we expand nuclear power to solve climate change? So I've sort of talked briefly about a range of reasons why even if this could be done, it would not be desirable. If you expand nuclear power, there is no way you're going to avoid the chance of accidents. Now, nuclear accidents don't happen every day. They are rare occurrences, but the more reactors you have, the more frequent they're going to become. There's no escaping that equation. And likewise, the more reactors you have, the more the risk of nuclear weapons proliferation, more countries acquiring the capacity to make nuclear weapons. Some of them will decide at some point. They may not be right now wanting to make nuclear weapons, but they might at some point. And having a nuclear power program only helps them. And lastly, all reactors are going to be producing waste, radioactive waste, which we don't know how to deal with. So these are all well-known problems. I don't want to sort of spend a lot of time talking about them, but I just want to assure you that they are all going to be applicable to small modular reactors as well. It's not that small modular reactors don't have these problems. But the more important thing to remember is how feasible is it that small modular reactors are going to help with this challenge of climate change. And to think about that, there are two things we need to remember. One is the cost of building plants, and I've spoken at some length about why nuclear power is not going to be economical. So every dollar we spend on small modular reactors or large reactors is a dollar that's not spent on some other way of trying to deal with climate change. So there's a huge opportunity cost. But I think the more important thing that we should be thinking about is looking at all the headlines that have been in the newspapers the last few weeks, talking about the latest IPCC synthesis report. And the IPCC basically said that if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius, then we need to do greenhouse gas emissions reductions rapidly and deeply. Okay, and one of the numbers they said was that we would like to see global GHG emissions being cut by nearly half by 2030. Okay, and if you were to think about this from any kind of viewpoint of justice, countries like the United States and Western Europe and so on, which are in much better off shape economically compared to the the lower income countries around the world, should actually do this faster. And that'll be the only sort of just way of doing it. And so we have to really prioritize pathways that will reduce emissions really quickly. And if you consider nuclear power, it's really not going to do that for you, because the process of constructing a nuclear plant is really long. The average nuclear plant takes about 10 years to build. And if you want to think about the time it takes before you can actually start digging a hole and pouring concrete, that can take another 5 to 10 years, because you have to get all the environmental permits, you have to find a site, and most important, raise the billions of dollars it requires to build one of these things. And that's a long process too. So I always say that, if my province here in Canada, British Columbia, it has no nuclear plants, but should the premier here decide that they're going to build a nuclear plant here, it will take 15 to 20 years before the first unit of electricity actually flows out of a potential nuclear plant, if that. And so it's definitely not going to be a quick process. And there are many reactors around the world which have taken much longer. The reactor that is sort of being built closest to where I grew up in southern India, it's started construction in 2004. It's still not yet ready. I see there's a question. I'm happy to stop. Lynn?
So that just means you're just saying it's not agile, So
yeah,
I mean, potentially before 2024, you can start deconstructing this plant, because it's no longer, yeah.
Nuclear power is not agile in sort of two ways, in terms of how quickly it can be deployed, but also in terms of the output, and we can talk about it during the Q&A. Let me just finish. I just have just a couple more slides, so I'll just finish that, and then we can have a more fulsome discussion. So constructing nuclear plants is a really long process. Small modular reactors are not going to really help. On paper, many of these reactors can be built really fast. So till recently, till some years ago, Westinghouse, the company that designed the AP1000 reactor that's being built in the state of Georgia, used to have this nifty looking computer animated video that shows the reactor, the various modular parts coming together, click, 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 like sort of a time-lapse video. And it basically will show 36 steps. And then at the end of 36 steps, the reactor is ready on the computer. But in actual fact, in the real world, Vogtle construction started in 2013. It's still not yet complete, right? So what happens in the computer world does not happen in the real world. So small modular reactors are also going to take a long time. And if you look at any experience with the specific designs, you will see this happening all the time. And also, it's not just a matter of some high-level interest. So if the governments were to suddenly decide, we have to prioritize nuclear power, then suddenly it is going to happen. Governments have repeatedly put lots of resources into nuclear power. And the best example is the so-called nuclear renaissance that happened in the United States. In the Bush administration, under the 2005 Energy Policy Act, the government put lots of money through loan credits and so on and so forth, a whole bunch of schemes to try and promote nuclear power. And there were about 30 reactors around the country that were ordered. And the expectation was that there'd be 15 large reactors operating by 2021. In fact, only 4 of those reactors actually moved from the planning phase. And of those, 2 of them in the state of South Carolina were abandoned after $9 billion was spent, essentially for a deep hole in the ground. And what's left is this Vogtle plant, which I've talked about. So, and the same thing you can look in the case of the United Kingdom. Again, there was a lot of talk about a bunch of nuclear reactors coming online by 2020 during both the Tony Blair and the Gordon Brown governments, and nothing has happened so far. So the basic point is that, if you were to think about trying to protect the climate, there are the two quantities there are three quantities involved. One is the amount of carbon that a power source emits. Nuclear is low on that. There's a sort of debate over what about the life cycle, and we can talk about that later on. But let's give it the benefit of doubt and say it is a low carbon source. But we also have to think about the cost and the time it takes. And so on the whole, I would say it's not feasible to meet any of the important climate targets using nuclear power, whether they are small reactors or large reactors. I will stop there and open up for any questions. Thank you very much. I know I went through this very fast, but I wanted to leave plenty of time for Q&A, and I'm happy to sort of repeat any of the things that I may have glossed over when I spoke.
Thank you very much for a power-packed and intense presentation, which will be vetted in a few minutes here. Our procedure now is we will move to this next phase where people will have the opportunity to ask questions and engage in discussion. And I'm going to turn the instructions over for that to our board member, Jan Budart, who monitors this part of the operation. I'll put the chat box in order so folks can put links and questions in the chat box. And I'll remind you at the end of tonight to save the chat, or if not, contact us and we'll be glad to send it to you. So Jan, take it away. And take yourself off mute.
Exactly. I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I think you've already been well rewarded. And so I've got a few instructions about asking questions and getting answers. Each person gets one follow-up question. I mean, if you ask a question and then you feel like you want to just follow it up, you may do that once. However, more than once means that somebody else is not going to get a chance. Now, if you're making a comment or you have a long question that takes a preamble, or you don't need any feedback from the speaker, your comment may not be more than 3 minutes. And please do not ask a series of questions. Do one question at a turn with one follow-up. And here's how you get into the stack. You raise your hand from the icon at the bottom of the screen where it says reactions. You click on reactions and it says raise hand, and your hand will be raised like that. And then when you're done, you can lower your hand or I will lower it for you. And then, okay, and if you don't like that and you want to go into the stack, go into the chat and put the word stack, then I will try to keep track of who raised their hand or put the word stack in the chat first. And you will get a second chance to speak if we have come to the end of all other questions, and you have a second question, then I can call on you a second time. So I hope there aren't any questions about the questions, because we already have a hand from Linda Lewison, who is one of our board members. So unmute yourself, please, Linda, and ask your question. You remuted yourself. You got remuted, Linda. Well, I think, oh, there you are. Okay, go ahead.
So thank you very much for, as Dave said, just a power-packed presentation. Just really outstanding. My question is about the subject of radioactive waste. I would like to hear your thoughts on it, whatever you think you want to add here, but most specifically, how do you compute the cost? I mean, often we talk about that it's endless, and what would you have to say about that and the effects of it as you reflect on your thoughts about nuclear power and specifically small modulars?
You're
Yeah.
muted.
Let me start with the small modular part. Small modular reactors will produce the same kinds of wastes. Some designs are going to be producing waste that are even harder to deal with because they are mixed with certain kinds of chemicals. So for example, some kind of fast reactors, fast neutron small modular reactors are using fuel that involves sodium, and you cannot bury sodium in the ground because sodium does not behave well in the presence of water. So there are going to be a bunch of complications with small modular reactors that make it harder to deal with the waste. Now, more generally, so the second another part of the question that you asked was about the cost of it. It's very difficult to cost how much it is to come up with estimates of how much it's going to cost to deal with radioactive waste, because we don't have any demonstrated example anywhere. There is no operating repository for commercial nuclear power plants. Finland and Sweden are planning to construct one. They are sort of in the early stages, but we really don't know how they are operating, right? The one example we have is from the WIP site, the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico. And as most of you probably know, in 2014, there was a major accident there involving an explosion in a container that had plutonium in it. And so the cost of that kind of an accident was presumably not included in the cost estimates, right? And there's no reason to expect that, future repositories may not have such accidents. But there is, of course, the more fundamental problem that you have to think about maintaining one of these repositories for a really long period of time. And depending on how you deal with it, if you just think about it as a deep hole, you just bury it and you shut it down and you just forget about it, then the cost is sort of, only for those years when you are digging those tunnels and putting stuff inside there. But if you are thinking about a repository that you would like to actually monitor, then there are costs involved in that. Now, all of this becomes easier when accountants sort of deal with it, because they use a procedure called discounting, that costs which are occurring in the future, the present value of those costs are lowered by some kind of a discount factor that becomes that basically reduces the cost, because the idea is that if I had that money, I could put it inside a bank or invest in some fashion, it will grow. And therefore, when you're thinking about cost to be spent far in the future, the inverse of that happens. And that kind of discounting procedure basically makes all these costs seem very manageable. Okay. Now, that said, historically, the world over, in the UK and other places, they have often found that the estimates that utilities had come up with for how much they're going to spend on waste management have been gross underestimates. And ultimately, it's the taxpayer who's going to have to pay it. Now, there's a larger question of what we should do with radioactive waste. I don't want to get into that now because that's a very big topic and it's also a very divisive topic. Different people have different opinions. So let's sort of park that aside. And that's something, all I would say is that it is something that has to be societally determined. However, I think it's premature in a way to start discussing that till we actually stop producing this kind of material. If it's so difficult to deal with, if it's so expensive, if it's so hazardous, then first let's stop building, making more of it before we try to figure out how to deal with what has already been there. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, Alfred, you are next. Thank you, Steve.
Yes, thank you very much for the most informative presentation this evening. I have 2 points. One is, early in your talk, you mentioned that nuclear power costs too much to build, but then you alluded to except in special circumstances. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on what those special circumstances are, and whether or not, perhaps, in my opinion, the SMRs contribute to proliferation insofar as they support the nuclear infrastructure that's needed for nuclear weapons and the nuclear navy. And it seems to me that there's been a full court media campaign to make every little town across the country think that an SMR is coming tomorrow. And in the meantime, it supports the literal industrial academic infrastructure needed for the production of nuclear weapons in the nuclear navy. I'd appreciate your comments on those concepts. Thank you.
Great. So I have read your article about the linkages between nuclear weapons and nuclear power, Alfred. And so I completely agree that the connection is very, very important. And what I usually add to that is to say, historically, what the nuclear energy industry has done is to try and obscure those connections. Ever since Atoms for Peace, they have kind of said, oh, don't worry, nuclear weapons, that's a bad atom, here's a good atom, and so on and so forth. But what we have seen in recent years, but I'll say even historically speaking, many countries embarked on nuclear power, partly because they realized this was going to give them a pathway to making the bomb. So, we have documented cases of that in, let's say, Pakistan and India and so on and so forth. So there's definitely that historical example. But what's more interesting in recent years is that precisely when the nuclear industry is doing badly economically, that's when the industry really brings out the connections, right? So we saw, the moment the Trump administration took over, people like Ernie Moniz, who were in the Obama administration, they went out into the NGO world. And the first thing they were saying is, oh, you should be supporting nuclear power because it is very important for our nuclear navy. It's important for our nuclear weapons infrastructure, right? And the same thing in the UK, where they talk about the connection with the Trident, right? Submarine. So definitely SMRs are part of that. And you can see this happening in real time in Australia. So in Australia, they've sort of reversed the whole thing. They are hoping that the process of getting a nuclear submarine through the AUKUS deal will actually catalyze their nuclear energy industry there. So the connections between them run both ways, and it is definitely a reason why we should be opposing it. Your other question about special circumstances. So what I was trying to say was not so much that reactors are going to be cheaper, but the question that sort of the puzzle that some people might have is why in a country like the United States, which is supposedly based on, the market and trying to decide whether something is profitable or not, why would a private company actually embark on building a nuclear power plant? And if you look at the history in the last few decades, especially after the process through which many of the energy markets were opened up to competition, the kind of the economic restructuring that happened, what you find is that in these liberalized markets, no utility is actually planning to build a reactor pretty much anywhere. The places where they do build, there is a process by which they can go through some kind of a public utilities commission or some body like that. And once that body says it's fine to build this, that's when they go on to building. And at that point, they basically transfer all the costs and the risks to the public, either to the ratepayers or to the taxpayers. And this is what happened in Georgia and in South Carolina. And you can see this actually, in the state of Georgia, the profits of Georgia Power sort of having a big blip the moment the legislation passed the law which allowed them to pass on the costs. So from the viewpoint of the CEOs of these organizations, from the investors there, they have a very good case for building nuclear power plants because all the cost is going to be borne by the public, but the profits are going to go into their pockets, right? So that's what I meant by special circumstances. Thank you.
Okay.
I call that nuclear socialism.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot. That's a really interesting special circumstance. Stephen, will you please unmute and ask your question?
Yes. Hey, this is Stephen Sondheim. I was just about to ask about the extension of the conversation we just had. What concerns me is these huge pots of money, huge, in the IRA. And there's going to be a feeding frenzy. There already is in roads and many other environmental things. And my problem is I think a lot of people are going to get into it who don't necessarily know what they're doing. They're going to be different. It's just going to be crazy. And I think I wanted to point that out, what I think, but I think it could be corralled somewhat if you held builders of these technologies responsible for success at interim points, so that they don't just get the money forever and build and then run away. And this could serve to sober them a little bit and maybe even take some of the risks too. You mentioned the risk. What do you think of that? What do you think of that?
I think it's a good idea. I don't think it's being going to be practiced, right? And if and when governments were going to put this kind of a condition, you will see a strong pushback from the nuclear lobby. They will basically talk about how the government is interfering with our innovation. We see this, forget about the financial part. They would, all reactor vendors would say that they're building safe reactors, but they don't want the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to be sort of interfering or to be looking into that, right? They are all the time complaining about how the NRC, which, from our perspective, is not really even a good regulatory institution. They're too soft on the vendors. We would think that the vendors complain that they are, stifling their innovative ideas and things of that sort. So it's not likely that they're going to accept something of the sort. And what's more, I think in some cases, so I'll speak a little bit about the case in Canada here. Canada also is doing the same kind of thing, albeit with much less money. So they have given money, the federal government and the provincial governments have given money to various new SMR vendors. And one of them, for example, is called Moltex, and the federal government gave them $50 million. And Moltex as an idea does not even seem to make sense technically. And the government seems to have given them the money without any detailed review of even the concept. Forget about, the staged process, right? It's almost as though it's like Santa Claus having come there and he has to give away all those gifts. And each of these governments is sort of priding themselves on how much money they are putting into this. And so it's not, I wish they would do it, but they don't, I think, are not going to put conditionalities.
Yeah, well, thank you. I just think if they had to produce results, they might back off of it somewhat.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Stephen. And we're going to go on now to Evan. Go ahead and ask your question, Evan. And your last name would help too.
Sure. My last name's Craig, Evan Craig, and I enjoyed the presentation quite a bit. I noticed that the slide showed how nuclear power can't compete. That was your point on cost with renewable energy. And, when I talk to nuclear advocates about that, they say, well, what are you going to do at night when the wind isn't blowing? And so I would like you to address the question of availability and reliability of nuclear compared to renewables.
Yeah, great question. And this is, of course, the standard argument that is being addressed, and that's being offered for nuclear power today. And there are sort of two ways to think about it. One is to go back to the point that Lynn made about nuclear power not being agile. So there are sort of two ways in which it's not agile. One is how long it takes to build one of these. But the other is that nuclear reactors typically are not the right way to try and balance out the variations of output from wind and solar power, because reactors don't really like to go up and down in the amount of power they produce. They can do it, but they do it with some penalty in terms of the safety risks and in terms of the wear and tear of some of the equipment. And most importantly, there's a financial cost to it. Because a nuclear power plant is such a big investment, the utilities want to run those things 24/7. Because that's the only way they're going to recoup their costs. Now, if you're going to say, well, you're going to be operating your nuclear plant only when the wind is not blowing, only when the sun is not shining, then you're already cutting out half of those hours, right? And so the cost per unit of electricity production is going to go up. So it's in some ways, nuclear power is not a good solution to this problem. But the larger point is a important one. And I would say two things. First is that is a problem, or the problem of trying to deal with the variability of renewables is something that is going to become important only when renewables become a much, much larger fraction of the grid than what is today, right? So maybe 15, 20 years ago, models of the grid would say once the grid has more than 30 to 40% of variable renewables, then the grid becomes unstable. Now, the same kind of models from the Department of Energy or from the and other sort of modelers would say that you can run the grid up to about 80 to 90% and compensate for the variability at a very modest cost. So you have to do something about it, but it's not like as though you have to build a whole new parallel infrastructure that is going to be producing power, right? And it's only, the question is all about the last 10%, if you like. And
do
the
SMRs
fact is,
make a difference here? Does SMR argument change anything there?
not really, not really. It's the same issue, right? I mean, you can design a nuclear power plant to be varying its output, but the cost, the economic cost is going to be higher. That doesn't matter whether it's a large reactor or a small reactor. And I'm already telling you that small reactors are going to be more uneconomical. So the problem becomes worse in a way for SMRs. But the point is that in the last 10%, if you want to talk about it, that's something that's going to happen in 2040, 2045, all right? Whatever it is, some future date like that. And the energy modeling community has had a pretty poor track record of predicting future costs and future technologies. For a very long time, they expected that nuclear power would become very cheap, and that didn't happen. Okay. And for a long time, they also thought that renewables will always be expensive, and that has also not happened. So there's no reason to actually believe that we know what the costs are going to be in 2040, 2045, whenever it is, right? And the last thing I'd say is, there are many models for how you can deal with variability. By and large, you can sort of think about three buckets of trying to deal with it. One is this kind of the dumb way or the obvious way is to build batteries and storage devices of some kind. But that's often the most expensive way. But the two other ways are to rely on diversity of technologies and diversity of geography, right? So if the wind is not blowing in Illinois, maybe it is blowing in Massachusetts. And if the grids are connected, then you can sort of deal with that. The other possibilities, wind and solar are not the only things. You also have small hydro, you can have maybe geothermal, biomass, there's a whole bunch of things, right? So all of these together can combine to form a pretty stable kind of output, or at least predictable output. And the last thing is all of this assumes that, the most of the people, when they talk about nuclear power, they say it's a great baseload source of power. Baseload basically means that the output is going to be constant. The problem is that our demand is not baseload. Our demand from society goes up and down, right? And so you need actually flexibility in the supply side also. And what has been changing over the years is that the ability to modify demand at the consumer side, not just as an individual going off and switching off our light, but also at the level at which the utility can control some of these things. That could be another big source. But basically, I think this is it's a red herring in a way.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Evan. And if you put in the chat where you're from or your email, that would be great. Our next, and I wanted to mention that Ace Hoffman says that the small modular reactor business is a job program for the Navy. That was in the chat. Okay, Stephanie, would you please unmute and ask your question?
You had mentioned that the SMNRs will produce waste and need uranium as a fuel. I've heard the term HALEU. Is that some kind of energy source these new reactors might need?
HALEU just stands for high assay low enriched uranium. It's also a kind of uranium. So typically in nature, uranium has two kinds of isotopes, uranium-235 and uranium-238. The bulk of the uranium is 99.3% is uranium-238, the heavier variety, and the remaining 0.7% is U-235. In order to operate a reactor, you have to increase the U-235 fraction if you're operating light water reactors like what the United States use. In Canada, here we use some things called heavy water reactors, which can operate with natural uranium. The new versions of reactors, for example, the natrium reactor that TerraPower, the organization that Bill Gates has funded, those kinds of reactors require uranium to be enriched to closer to 20%, so much higher than the current levels. And the United States doesn't have capacity to make that much of that at this point. So that's why they're talking about restarting all these enrichment facilities. So it's not a different kind of a fuel. It's also uranium fuel, but it just has to be produced in a different way.
Okay, and the United States is not capable of producing that.
Certainly not in the quantities that are required.
Where is that produced?
So in Russia has a lot of this material, right?
Okay.
So initially, the Bill Gates company, people were thinking they were going to just import the fuel from Russia, and all of that became politically infeasible after February 2022.
And this involves new ideas in the United States about more mining and more milling, and it's very controversial about creating HALEU. Okay, John D. Miller, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Am I unmuted yet?
Yes, you now are. Yes.
Okay. I would like to know if you agree with something that Ed Lyman said to this group back in November, that it's the diseconomies of scale that have caused the SMR vendors to want, and the NRC to want to help them remove lots of safety requirements. No need to have very qualified staffers, no need to have armed guards, no need to have a containment around the reactor. Do you agree? And if so, could you just expand on that and say what your views are?
Definitely, yeah. So I definitely agree with Ed, who's been following this stuff much more closely than I have in some ways. He's more involved in the debates at the NRC and so on and so forth. And the point is simple. The SMRs vendors should know that they are not going to be economically viable. And so they are trying to save every possible penny they can. So this is why there was a lot of pressure on the NRC to loosen a lot of their requirements. I, for example, looked at the efforts to make the what's called the emergency planning zone, the area where the local governments and other such officials would have to be involved in planning for potential accidents. How do we evacuate people, stuff of that sort, and SMR vendors. So that process, costs a few $1 million per year. And SMR vendors were very, very adamant that they would have to reduce the EPZ to the site boundary, meaning that no local official needs to be paid for this. And if you look at the numbers, you'll say, why are they sort of obsessing over a few $1 million? Your whole thing is going to be costing so much, right? And the reason is that they are trying to save every possible penny. And so that is also a way to sort of counter one of the arguments which is being made, which is that if you small reactors are safer, right? Now, from a purely technical point of view, if all else is exactly the same, a small reactor is better than a large reactor. A small reactor is not safe, but it is safer in the sense that if there is an accident, the amount of radioactive material that it will spew out into the atmosphere will be smaller, simply because a smaller reactor, it has lesser of an inventory there. But that assumes that everything is the same, but everything is not being the same, right? The moment they come small, they say, oh, this is so much safer, so we can get rid of our containment. We can have only one reactor. And there's even one old company that fortunately seems to have gone under called Hyperion, and that in the old days, they used to say, we are going to operate our reactors with essentially one operator. And the joke he used to say was, our reactor control room will have a computer, a person, and a dog. And the purpose of the dog is to make sure that the person doesn't do anything to the computer. And the purpose of the person is to feed the dog, right? In other words, the computer is so, the reactor is so safe that a computer can essentially operate it, right? And so why are they sort of talking about it? Because they want to reduce all costs. And here there's another issue that actually is, I think, important, which they want to hide, which is that they want to have their cake and eat it too. On the one hand, SMR vendors would like to lower their costs by reducing all of these requirements, including the number of people they're going to be employing in these reactors. At the same time, they go around saying, oh, we are going to be a great job creation effort, right? The whole point of building SMRs as opposed to the old kind of reactors is to reduce how many people are going to be required. You want to have fewer people at the field site. You want to remove all the labor to the factories where a few people can man a lot of machines. So the whole point is to try and reduce the number of jobs it creates, because that's the only way they can try to reduce their costs. But at the same time, when they go to state legislatures, they would immediately say, oh, we're going to create lots of jobs. On a per dollar basis, that argument makes no sense whatsoever. Sorry, I just thought I'll add that point to my answer to your question.
Thank you. Now the next questioner is going to be Carolyn Kroom or John Tate, not sure which, but go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, it's Carolyn Kroom. And in the state of Texas, Abilene Christian University is proposing a
molten salt reactor.
An experimental reactor, right?
Molten salt reactor, yeah.
I'm sorry, a sodium, yeah, a molten salt research reactor with a graphite moderated fluoride salt using about 300 kilograms of 19.9% enriched uranium. So it would be HALEU. And I don't know where it is in the NRC process, but I think it's very close to being licensed. And our state legislature is in session now, and there's a whole bunch of bills that would be promoting this, unfortunately. And I don't know if this would help you, but the liquid fuel is lithium fluoride, beryllium fluoride, and uranium tetrafluoride. And it's described, this reactor is described as a simplified molten salt research experiment, which was a test reactor in the 1960s. And I wanted to ask you, oh my gosh, when we're lobbying our conservative state legislature, and I'm sorry I'm not in y'all's state, but I'm I'm in Texas. What are some good arguments for idiotic conservatives? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be saying idiotic, but things that they'll go, oh, I didn't think about that, or whatever. And then my other question was, how would this reactor, if it gets built, get HALEU? I mean, get that fuel.
Yeah, great question. So I threw in something into the chat that I wrote about this last year, about the so-called molten salt reactors. And I think the sort of strongest argument against molten salt reactors is the fact of how they operated the one molten salt reactor that was built at Oak Ridge in Tennessee in the 1960s, how bad its performance was. And I've sort of done all the numbers in that article, so you please look at that. And the second thing to remember is that basically what's going to happen is this reactor, if it is built, and they manage to get the HALEU. That's a great question. Where are they going to get the HALEU from? Everybody is just kind of wishing that somehow there is going to be a magic wand that is going to be, waved, and a bunch of HALEU is going to appear somehow from Centrus, the plant that is being built in Ohio. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. But that's something which they would like to just kick that problem down the line. They just want to sort of start talking about it, because right now is the time. If they wait till HALEU is actually available, they might lose out on all the billions of dollars that are sort of being thrown around at this point. And this is like a really nice time for the nuclear industry to make hay while the sun shines. And so that's why they're not going to talk about the HALEU problem at this point. But anyway, coming back to the challenge there. So this university is probably going to be, if it's going to build it, is going to be ending up with this molten salt radioactive waste product that's going to be extremely difficult to deal with. And you just have to look at how hard it has been to deal with the waste from a reactor that just operated for 4 years, which is very low power, way back in the 1960s, from 1965 to 1969. And they still haven't dealt with that waste. It's still sitting there, right? So that's, I think, those are the most strongest points that I can think of. So I wish you all the luck, and it's glad that we have people there in Texas also sort of talking about this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now our next questioner is under the name of Money. So please unmute yourself and ask your question. You're still muted, Money.
You're muted.
I think he may be frozen also. You want to
Okay,
move to the next question?
Money,
come back.
Money, we're going to come back to you and let David. Oh, wait, now speak.
Am I Money?
Yeah.
That's what your name
Oh,
says.
Jesus, I had no idea. I'm sorry. I thought my name was in there. Oh, I
No.
apologize very much. My
But
name's
it wasn't-
Laverne Trayan. I didn't realize it was under Money. I only have a simple question. How do I get this video presentation on a video? Because it was a great presentation. And how do I get your documents that you used so I can print them? And because I need to get this information to the people who are making these decisions.
Oh, yes, well, that would be the problem of NEIS. So please put your real name in the chat along with your email, and we'll do the best we can to get back to you with the information you want. We also already have Ramana's slides.
Yeah, I'm happy to have that shared.
Yeah. We can
Okay.
already share the slides.
And
Okay.
then just one more little thing I'd like to say. For all the people here who are trying to organize and get this information to the media, I recommend that you download Stringer. That's Stringer without an E. It's an app, and you can videotape your meetings, you can videotape your protests, and then you can upload it to Stringer, and Stringer's in New York, and then they will sell that video to any news media outlet in the world that wants to purchase it. It may or may not sell. It does. I use it quite a bit, and stuff sells all the time. Because local media are not sending reporters out to these protests and are not sending people out to videotape them. So you videotape them, upload it to Stringer, and then they can download it from Stringer. So I just wanted to throw that as an organizational tool.
And what is your connection with all this?
With what? With Stringer?
Or we just wanted to know what your background is.
Oh, I DoorDash. I mean, I'm a photographer. I'm an activist. I participated in the closing of the nuclear power plant here at Fort Calhoun. Pretty much me and Charles, you'll see on this, we're the two that spearheaded that effort. Also, I've been advocate. I ran for the OPPT board 3 times, I guess, over my lifetime. Starting in the 90s, 2008, and then 2010. And then advocate. Just my interest is in our public utility and going and constantly getting them to do the right thing. And recently they haven't. They have started to tell this. Well,
Join the
they've been
club.
they've been doing really good with wind and solar, and now they're experimenting with battery technologies, and they're doing lots of good things.
Listen,
go-
Laverne, we're
so-
going to
Yep.
interrupt you now so that
Sure.
we can go on to the rest of the questions. And
You
let's
betcha.
Dave Kraft ask this question. Don't forget to unmute. Ah, you do. Okay.
Thanks for joining us. And before I ask my question, I want to point out there are two comments in the chat that might need addressing from Laura Davis and Mickey Merrick. So be sure to add them into the queue.
Yes, we've got Mickey in the queue because his was a question.
Okay, got it. So here's my situation. I gave a presentation not too long ago at Sierra Club or on Zoom. And many of the designs I've seen, particularly the micro reactors and the mini nukes, their illustrations show that as a safety measure, they usually locate the reactors below grade or below ground, depending, and they claim that that is their safety mechanism. In my presentation, I juxtaposed photos of the bomb craters in Mariupol, Ukraine, as the following slide, and I asked which one was deeper. So my question here is, I asked people to do a thought experiment. If Ukraine had gotten small modulars 10 years ago and put in 50 or 100 in the industrial city of Mariupol at those industrial sites, what would you have there today given the Russian bombardment? Now, the second part of the question is to you, Ramana, is, are you aware of the peace and weapons activists getting alarmed by the expansion of small modulars? Because quite frankly, I would say there's a lower probability of a thermonuclear exchange, but when we proliferate 10,000 small reactors around the world, there's an increasingly higher probability of nuclear contamination from things like what happened in Mariupol.
Yeah. So the answer to the Mariupol question or the Ukraine question is kind of obvious. You would be left with a radioactive mess in all those places. And, adding to all of the other challenges those poor people there are sort of going through. But in terms of the connections between the peace and disarmament movement and, nuclear activists, nuclear power activists, those are weak at this point. And I see that more as a sign of how weak all of us are. The number of problems we all have to be challenged with, that we're to fight against, is just proliferating by the day. And so, there's only 24 hours in a day and you have to sleep for a little bit. So it's really difficult for them to be getting involved in everything. But I think you would find a very sympathetic audience. I don't think there's going to be a lot of people out there saying, oh, we are all for small modular reactors. The one problem, though, is that the nuclear industry is really controlling the narrative here. And they are often saying this is the solution to climate change. And many people, even sort of well-meaning people, are inclined to thinking, well, everybody seems to be saying, the Republicans are voting for it, the Democrats are voting for it, the liberals in Canada are voting for it, the conservatives are, everybody is doing it. So maybe there's something there, right? And so there's a lot of support, I think, that is tacit, not because they've done a deep dive into this, but because they see this as the only game in town, or at least an important game in town. And that's the thing that we really need to be fighting against.
Thank you. Okay, Lynn, you're back.
Yeah. I appreciate your comment about 24 hours in the day and $9 billion losses. My God, but I do the best I can. So sorry I missed the first half hour, but I have inclinations of how these things operate. So I'd kind of like the major talking points, because inevitably what happens with me, MV, is that I end up spontaneously, I've got to be down at the house on a Zoom protesting this bill or that bill. And I'm an ultrasound technologist, so what I usually do, because I have 10 city boards that I follow seriously, and that means 6 hours a night, generally just for that. So, but I've got a really broad perspective of a lot of things. So I'd like to know the major talking points and I listen, and I'm a curious person. So I heard about tritium leaks by Excel up near the Mississippi border, and Excel territory is Minnesota.
Minnesota, yeah.
Yeah, Minnesota. Right. So I just spewed out something about that. And my friend was at the House meeting, said, that was great that came up. So, sometimes I can just happen to say the right thing, or I listen to other people and get the impression. But what I've felt and what I can personally do myself lately, I've been thinking, because I've been cold for 23 years, for 6 months of the year, very cold, and it's 40 degrees in my house, so my pipes don't freeze, but it makes me not want to go outside all winter because it's colder out there. So I wanted to get a ground loop heat pump, but that only solves the war in Ukraine, right? Because no more gas. But I can't turn on the lights with my ground loop heat pump. And I can't fix my roof until I do my attic, and contractors just want to scrape everything, and the housing crisis and all. So I can't get solar on my place. I could buy solar, but the general idea is distributive, and this SMRs, like distributive nuclear, no, I mean, if you're looking to target, like people have brought up, then you can target 1 million of these things, politically, and destroy them and destroy a lot of lives and stuff. But and do you know what reactive energy is? Trading between houses, and with batteries and microgrids and reactive energy trading. I think that base load demand, the duck curve and everything can be dealt with. So that's my general impression. But with as far as the SMRs, and I don't always get to a full meeting. I'm sorry, I only have 24 hours in the day. But there's a lot. I've got an impression of a lot of water. I mean, the wars of the future are water, right? And these nuclear reactors, a lot of water. So is it more water with the SMRs? And what are the quick talking points? And I've heard all the talking points from the people at the House and the nuclear people yesterday, jobs, well,
can we let Ramana answer your question?
She has, I'm sorry, Lynn, but your comment is.
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Do you have,
Yes.
oh, wait.
So I'll say very briefly, I think, Linda has already put in some talking points that Beyond Nuclear has come up with, and they are excellent points. But I think the, SMRs are going to require water if they are light water reactors, just like every other reactor. And they will typically require more water per unit of electricity produced for exactly the same reasons that I mentioned earlier, because they are going to be less efficient at converting the fission power into electrical power. Now, your other questions about how to, distributed generation, so on, they're big questions. I'll just say for this discussion, let me just say, I think SMRs are really not going to help you at a home level. It's not like that Back to the Future film where, there's something which looks like a Mr. Coffee, coffee bean grinder that you can put in your backyard and make power. That's not the way SMRs work. So, yeah.
But distributive,
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, say on tritium, that tritium leak.
Yeah, so on tritium, sorry, yeah. So,
nastier
tritium is a very problematic material because it's one of the few things that can actually go through the placental barrier. So if you absorb tritiated water, which is the form in which it's going to come in, the tritium will behave just like water. Tritium is essentially just a radioactive version of hydrogen. And so its chemical properties are identical to hydrogen, which means that it is going to behave just like water or like one of the organic chemicals once it comes inside your body. And it's one of the few things that can be passed on from a mother to a fetus. And so this is a pretty problematic thing. Yeah. So the person who's done a lot of work on this is Arjun Makhijani. He's written a lot about this, and so his at Institute for Energy and Environmental Research. So you might want to look at his work. I'll put the link in the chat.
Wow, that's
Okay,
a connection to
well,
my ultrasound.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you, Lynn. And now there's a question between Mickey and Catherine. Catherine raised her hand really early, and now it's back up. And so we're going to get Catherine's question, and then we're going to the chat to read Mickey's question.
And
Okay.
Laura Davis also had a question in there too.
Sure. Okay. So Catherine, could you go ahead, please?
Thank you. Yeah, it's been pretty informative. I kind of like listened in on a meeting with the nuclear people a couple years ago when they were like planning out the SMR stuff, and they are very methodical. And they're at the point now, they don't call them SMRs anymore. They call them advanced modular reactors. They call it advanced because they're in a phase now where they're going mostly to third world countries like in South America and stuff, and getting them licensed and doing trial runs and stuff. But their plans are like global. They want to pepper the whole world with these little nuclear reactors, which of course I think is a very bad idea. So my basic question is, what is an effective way that we can stop their plans on a global scale?
So great question. First thing I'd say is that the word advanced is partly because there was a phase when they were talking about small modular reactors. It wasn't really getting them the kind of money they wanted. So then they went to the government and they started talking about advanced reactors, which just means they're not light water reactors. But those terms really don't mean a lot. I mean, they used to talk about Gen 4 before that. They are all meant to just, make people think something completely different is happening, and somehow the new technologies are without problems. In terms of going abroad, I think the talk is more loud than the actual fact. I don't think there's a single contract out there that somebody has actually agreed to spend the billions of dollars it's going to take to build one of these things. The press doesn't always get it right. They will, any contract, they will say, oh, there's a contract now for a SMR. So for example, they would say, they're going to build a bunch of them in Poland or in Romania and so on. Now, that I think is the one area which we really need to watch. Eastern Europe, in part because of what's been happening in Ukraine, a number of them have become much closer. They want to have much closer ties with the United States. And as part of that, they're all signing contracts to build, large reactors from Westinghouse or small modular reactors from NuScale or General Electric, Hitachi. And that's the one area where there's some real activity. In a lot of other places, it's just basically talk at this point, which doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. But I think many countries are sensibly thinking that they don't want to be guinea pigs here. If you don't manage to build one of these in your own country and show that it is actually on budget and on time and it is safe and so on and so forth, why would they want to be the guinea pigs? I think that's a very sensible thing many developing countries are sort of talking about. So anyway, all I would say is that don't get too sort of worried by what the media is saying, but it's sort of, yeah.
Okay, now Laura, would you like to ask your question, or do you want us to read it from the chat? Laura Davis, are you still here? Is Laura still here? I don't see her. So let's go on to Mickey's question. Mickey, how about you asking your question, or do you want us to read it from the chat?
Yeah, I can read the question here. It's about the commitment to this, small modular reactor project that OPG and TVA are sort of going ahead with. It's not easy. I mean, when these large nuclear utilities come together, OPG has the 18 of the 19 reactors in Canada are operated by OPG or by Bruce Power, which has a sort of connection with OPG. The OPG, sorry, is Ontario Power Generation. And TVA is Tennessee Valley Authority, that also has a historical nuclear connection. And when they sort of come together, it is becoming harder for us to fight those things. So, the one thing to remember is that the particular design they have both selected, the BWRX-300, has never been approved by any nuclear licensing authority, either by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. The CNSC has a process called the Pre-Licensing Vendor Design Review, and GE Hitachi submitted the BWRX-300 to them, and they discovered a bunch of problems with it, which they said might become, they will have to address it before they actually formally submit it for a license. So, I think there is going to be many a slip between the cup and the lip, to use a cliched phrase, between what numbers GE Hitachi is saying today, and when they come up with a serious project proposal and serious costing, you will find that the cost is going to go up. And by the time they go through any of these regulatory processes, you'll find that the design will have to be changed a bunch of times. This is what happened with the larger ESBWR reactor that GE Hitachi had designed earlier. So I'm not certain that all these plans they're talking about are actually going to go forward in the way it is. But that doesn't mean that we should not be looking at it. You have to be looking at those things.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay, now Laura talked about an article that appeared in the Atlantic this month, and she asks, this article mentions different companies using different materials for cooling reactors, such as helium, salt and water, relying on convection and gravity rather than pumps. What do you think of these kinds of innovations?
It's in our culture, it is very bad to talk against innovation. Innovation is supposed to be like mother and apple pie. So you always have to say innovation is good. But the question, again, goes back to the discussion we had earlier about what these companies are saying is going to be the implication of their innovations. They then go on to say, oh, ours is such an innovative idea. We don't need containment. We don't need an emergency planning zone. That's where the problem really comes. And the other thing which is happening is many of these so-called innovations are actually very hard to quantify. So, the way to remove the heat from the core, we want that to be very reliably removed. Otherwise, you will have a meltdown. And in traditional plants, the way that is done is by having these large pumps that would circulate water at a very high rate in the event that there's some accident is starting up. Now, in these newer designs, the claim is that these natural forces like gravity and so on and so forth are going to remove the heat. The problem with that assumption is that the rate at which the heat will be removed is far less reliably calculated in those things. And so there are some big challenges. And it's not that these designs have not been approved by any regulator. So until a good regulator looks at them carefully and evaluates it, we really cannot make any strong statements. What looks great on paper may not actually work in the real world.
Yes. Okay. Now it looks like there aren't any more questions, and we are 4 minutes over our
Actually, Jan, excuse me, this is Dave. There are two other questions. Nicole Salisbury had one in chat, and Linda Gunter had one in chat.
Oh, sorry. Okay, let's take a look at those.
So the question about the base load. So traditionally, the way that electricity grid managers, people who try to make sure that the power will come on when you switch on a light. The way they try to manage was to look at the demand and divide it up into the supply, divide up the supply into saying there are some sources of power that are going to be on all of the time. This used to be nuclear or coal plants typically, and also combined cycle nuclear natural gas plants. And then a bunch of sources which are going to be either coming on only when the demand is very high, and some which they call intermediate. That whole paradigm of thinking about energy planning does not work with renewables, because renewables are neither base load nor are they really peak demand plants. They come on and come off when the wind is blowing, when the sun is shining. As I mentioned earlier, this does not mean that you cannot operate a grid reliably, but you'll have to do it differently. And in that different way of dealing with it, the concept of base load really makes no sense. So it's best to actually forget that idea. But that's not going to be easy, because the people who are operating these grids, they've all been trained in that traditional way. So till many of them sort of go away and a new generation of energy planners come in to manage these grids, this concept is going to be going around like a sort of, ghost from earlier times.
Could you explain how the grid is related to base load? Because I had the impression that with the renewables, since there would not be a base load, we need a completely different kind of grid.
Exactly. It's not a different kind of a grid. It's how you manage the grid. The grid is more or less, it's going to be what it is with some changes. The grid is basically the set of wires that run all over the place, right? And the question is, what is supplying the electricity at the other end of those wires? And if that changes, the way you're going to manage the power is going to be changing. And that means you're going to be always changing stuff, mostly at the supply end of it. There may be more wires in terms of increasing transmission capacity. But it's not as though, yes, I think the base load is more a concept rather than actually something physical. You can take a coal plant and operate it in a non-base load fashion. Nuclear plants in France don't operate in a base load fashion because France is dominated by nuclear power and the demand is not constant. So the nuclear power plants in France have to go up and down. They do what is called load following, which is not base load operations.
Okay. And Linda, what are your, she's quoting from Paul.
Paul, yeah.
What are your thoughts about SMNRs and the Congress's upcoming renewal of the Price-Anderson Act in 2025?
Geez, Paul, I have not really thought about that. I think the way that the SMR vendors would argue would be to say, our reactors are so safe, we don't need this kind of liability insurance and coverage and so on and so forth. And I guess we should be pushing back on that, saying, these are also capable of accidents. But over and above that, I don't have any sort of serious thoughts. The whole, Price-Anderson Act has a problem, and, how you do liability is a challenge. But SMRs are, I think the vendors will ask for some kind of a loophole through which they don't have to have such high insurance coverage. And again, it's part of the strategy of trying to save every penny they can.
Yeah, our reactors have always been insured by the taxpayer, because any kind of an accident, there is no utility that could actually cover it. And there's no private insurance company that would dream of insuring a nuclear power plant. So a Price-Anderson Act came in there to make sure that the public would pay for it if there was a problem. Okay, I think that as far as I can see,
Jen, one thing you didn't summarize your rebuttal of Laura's first question.
Oh, I cannot summarize my rebuttal. It was in an essay that I sent into the Atlantic, and anybody that wants that essay could ask for it at janbudar1@gmail.com.
Yeah.
Okay, I do believe it's time now to turn this meeting back over to Dave Kraft, and I will now do that. Dave, you want to close the
Okay.
meeting? Or?
Thank you, Jan. This was an incredibly vibrant discussion that we had tonight. The chat is really full of lots of good stuff. And want you all to know we will make the chat available. And actually, you can save it yourself if you're Zoom savvy by going down to the area that you would type your question in the chat. You'll find 3 little dots. And if you click those 3 little dots, a screen pop-up will be there and it'll ask you if you want to save the chat. And if you do, just say yes. But if not, we will send it out for those who have requested it in the chat.
David, when you get the recording, will it have the chat on it?
No, chat is always separate and it's a text file. You'll find it in your My Documents file of your computer. There'll be a Zoom file that gets set up and that's where you'll find your the chats.
Sometimes I see in webinars underneath, I see chat.
Yeah, well, we doing that. But we will be making a tape version of this available. We're going to try and edit it, but for those who really need it quickly, we can turn that around. I just wanted to pop up a little doodle I did the other day about small modulars. If people would like a copy of this, we could certainly make it available. But it really seems to be the situation we find ourselves in once again with the nuclear industry, hoodwinking legislators and the public and the media about yet another nuclear boondoggle. So I want to thank Ramana so much for this presentation. It generated lots of discussion. I think it was very educational to a lot of people. And if we could do standing ovations on Zoom, we would do it, but we can't. So I'm sorry about that. Thank you so much for being with us. Jan, do you want to talk about next month's Night with the Experts?
Yes, because Dave Kraft will be our expert in the middle of the month. We're having an extra Night with the Experts because the Illinois issues are world issues, and David's the person, he's the go-to person for Illinois. And I wrote down that this is going to be the one of the Thursdays in April, the 13th. And so keep an eye open for that, because what's going on in Illinois is really going to be an example for the rest of the country, if not the world. And then at the end of the month, we're going to be talking about the transportation of nuclear packages with Kevin Camps. He will be our expert. So I hope that you will be watching for Dave Kraft's talk about nuclear issues in Illinois and Kevin Camps talking about the transportation of nuclear packages.
Oh, Jan, Joan just asked, are there any nuclear reactors in Illinois leaking tritium?
I think, I'm not going to be able to answer that. The thing about tritium that is so annoying is that Watts Bar has been producing tritium for the War Department for about a decade now, and that leaks into the river out there. It might be the Susquehanna, but tritium is a whole other subject. And to find out about tritium, you should Google Ian Fairlie, Fairlie. Ian Fairlie is big on that, and so is Arjun. So there's plenty of information about tritium, and we really would like to have a Night with the Experts, but there's April, May. We wouldn't be able to have one about tritium until June. So please look up tritium. It's a truly fascinating story.
All right, and I think on that note, we're going to wrap things up tonight. Again, thank you, Ramana, for the time. Stick around for a few minutes. We want to do a wrap up with you. And we hope that we will see the rest of you twice next month, on the 13th about Illinois issues, and then on the 27th with Kevin Camps from Beyond Nuclear. So thank you all. Stay well and give them hell.
Thank you.
That's our job.
Merci beaucoup.
Thanks for coming, everybody. It's been really nice to have you.
Thank you all for
Thanks
this
for putting
opportunity
it
to speak.
on. Jen, is that the correct spelling of Fairlie?